Hi again, friends. Let's define culture and what are we talking about when we talk about culture? It's one of those words that's like a huge cloud, and you can divide it up in a lot of different ways. What I want to do is divide it up in a way and define it in a way that is actionable, because we're not interested in, the culture of the arts. We're not going to the Metropolitan Museum. We want to change the performance of our organization. So we want to look at culture as it affects the performance of your business. So that's our goal. Now, culture is problematic, and the reason it's problematic is because it's sticky. By sticky, I mean it doesn't change easily. You get stuck to it, like we get stuck to our habits, because our habits are our personal culture. The way we speak, the way we think, what we do when we get up in the morning, all those things are habitual for us. And anyone who has tried to change our own habits, and most of us have at some point, and most of us have failed at some point, we know it's hard. It's hard to change culture. So when you're trying to change the culture of a large group of people in an organization, it's not something that happens overnight. You cannot snap your fingers. You have to work at it over a period of years. And I know that, and I say, oh God, I'm not going to do that. But hey, you got to get started. And you can't ignore it, because strategy kills, or strategy is killed by culture. If the culture is contrary to the way you want your organization to perform in the future, your strategy is not going to work. So we have to have a strategy, an internal strategy, to change the culture, and that's what we're going to talk about. So let's start with the idea that strategy at its heart, if you will, is a set of beliefs, a set of values, a set of stories, myths, perhaps. If you go back to Rome and Greece and look at the Greek tragedies or the mythology of the Roman leaders and the way the leaders performed, the Caesars performed in order to maintain their mythology and to maintain their story, that was at the heart of the culture. The whole idea of what went on in the Colosseums of Rome was about preserving the idea of the warrior culture, the sacrificing culture that they believed had made Rome great. Well, in our organizations too, we have heroes, we have beliefs. Heroes are the people who project the beliefs, are models of our beliefs. And it's important to know who our heroes are, and it's important to talk about them, to tell the stories. Culture is carried forward through stories. It's why most of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, it's all stories. And those stories are really important. Those are the belief systems that are carried forward. So beliefs and values, what's important, are at the heart. And as we go forward and talk about how we're going to execute our strategy, I'm going to ask you to define what your beliefs are. What are the important beliefs? What are the important myths, if you will? What are the important stories in your culture upon which your strategy can be built, your execution, your future organization can be built? Then there are normative habits, the daily habits that we engage in, the time we come to work, the way we dress, the way we talk, what we think about, what our assumptions are about who solves problems. We have the Lone Ranger myth in American culture, where the Lone Ranger rides in from out of town. There's the rancher, and he always has his knockout granddaughter living with him. I don't know what that was about. But they always had the problem, but somehow they could never solve the problem themselves. How was the problem solved? Da, 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 da. Here comes the Lone Ranger with a mask on. You don't get to really know this guy very well. Why? Because people who have mythical powers to solve problems, we don't know where they sleep. We don't know how they get dressed in the morning. We don't know any intimate details of them, because that would destroy the myth. So we had this, sort of Lone Ranger idea. And, what was the first thing the Lone Ranger did the moment he solved the problem? You notice he never settled down and married the granddaughter. No, the moment the problem was solved, this is, by the way, Consulting 101. The moment the problem was solved, the Lone Ranger hightails it out of town. Trigger rears up on the hill. If any of you are old enough to remember that. That's mythology. It's a mythology, and it's a belief system about how problems get solved. Well, that belief system is directly contrary to the ideas that we now know work about lean manufacturing or lean culture, where the idea is that everybody is involved every day on a team, solving problems, experimenting, engaged in continuous improvement. That is a completely different story, a completely different set of habits, and one that works in today's world. I don't think the Lone Ranger myth was ever a reality, but we don't need to go into that. So normative habits, and those habits really are, you can think of in three forms. First of all, there's the overt behavior, our speech patterns, right? We all have a speech pattern that is weird to somebody else, right? But it's normal to us because it's the speech pattern of our parents and our community and who we grow up with. But we also, in addition to overt behavior, like how we dress and speak and so forth, there are emotional habits. Why do we say the Latin lover? What's that about? We never say the Eskimo lover. Ooh, boy, she was an Eskimo lover. She was frigid. Ooh, I don't think that's good. No, we say the Latin lover. She was hot. What's that about? Well, the reality is cultures closer to the equator have greater amplitude of emotional response patterns. Colder climates, don't ask me why, have a flatter emotional response patterns. Maybe it's because if you grow up in an igloo and you start yelling and screaming, they kick you outside. They say, well, he's cold now. They can come back in. So they do have flatter emotional response patterns. But we all have different emotional response patterns. And I have found, bouncing around as a consultant from company to company, that in different companies, and it largely is industry dependent, there are different emotional response patterns that have something to do with the nature of that industry. And then there are habits of thought, the habits of how we solve problems and who solves them. I want to get into what affects the culture, which is what we can manage. And the S's always seem to come up, the 5 S's or 6 S's or 7 S's. And they're related to strategy and they're related to culture. And systems of the organization, the structure of the organization, the skills that people have, the style of communication, symbols, like how people dress, where people park, the look of their offices, those are symbolic, and the stories in the organization. All those things affect the culture, and there's, of course, a chicken and egg thing. They're a result of a culture, right? I mean, the assumption about what kind of an office I should have is an assumption that comes from the culture that I've been immersed in, that I've grown up in. And because I may have those cultural beliefs, I create that office, right? So it's a circular or back and forth thing, but we have to intervene in it if we want to change the culture. Now, let's go back to the model of our organizational system that you've seen, and just think about this for a very short time. Think about all the externals, the economy, the customers, the political environment, etc. All those affect our culture because they affect how we behave on a day-to-day basis, and they affect the 3 subsystems. Now think about how the subsystems affect the culture of the organization. The technical system. I've worked in so many different industries, and you can see that there's a relationship between the nature of the work people do. For example, in a hospital or in a home health care organization. Due to the nature of the work, they hire certain kinds of people, right? Those people come in because they have desires and beliefs and needs and values, and that all affects the nature of the work they do, which is helping people. It's providing health care, right? So the nature of that technical system being that of caring for patients in a hospital, for example, that is going to affect the culture of the organization. All of the social system elements are about culture, right? Who we hire, how we train them, how we motivate them, how we organize them, all those social system things are culture. Ultimately, it's not the first thing, but ultimately the economic system, because it creates possibilities, it creates motivation, or it creates the opposite of that, will also affect the culture. Now, another way of thinking about the culture, and I must confess, I have had more models and have drawn more diagrams to describe the culture than over my many years. But so I hope I don't confuse you with them. But the fact is, there are multiple ways you can look at the culture. This is one. One way of thinking about the culture is there are qualities in the culture, like purpose, like values, a sense of urgency, the trust in the culture, etc. And there are levels. There is the individual level. You know, what my beliefs are, the degree to which I trust you and I trust my associates, that's part of the culture, right? So personal beliefs, personal habits are one level of the culture. The team, or if you will, the family in larger society. You know, we're all part of a group. It is a natural human need to be bonded to a small group of people, and it starts in our life, everywhere in the world, every culture, with what we call a family. And as we go to work, we're looking for that family. We're looking for that group that we bond with. And in most organizations today, you call that a team. And it may be the senior management team, or it may be our work team on the factory floor or wherever else we're doing our work. So we want to be part of a team, and there are disciplines or habits, call them what you want. Katas is another word for a discipline or a habit that gets practiced and becomes routine. In every organization, there are team disciplines, just like in sports. There are team disciplines, team beliefs, and habits that are part of the culture. And then there's the larger organizational culture. And again, as someone who's bounced from company to company, you can sense cultures. You can sense the fear that people have. You can sense the trust that people have. You can sense the urgency or not that people have to make improvement across the entire organization, across teams. So there are organizational qualities. And then if you like, and it's not the purpose of this course, but you can extrapolate that to the larger society or the larger community or the industry, if you will. Now, I've identified, and we'll talk more about this when we get into the lean culture assessment. I've got 3 assessments that I'm going to ask you to do in the next sections of the course. But these 11 qualities, purpose, values, urgency, trust, competence, customer focus, process, system structure, scorekeeping, and innovation. Those are qualities or characteristics or systems that reflect the nature of the culture and are important in the culture. And this graphic is the result of a survey, and I have an online survey that I use, and I'll make this available to you, to assess these different characteristics. And you can see this one organization. There were a healthcare organization, so they were high on purpose, they were high on values, trust, competence, customer focus were high, but when you got to scorekeeping, when you got to innovation, systems, processes, they weren't so hot. So that's important. That tells us what characteristics in the culture we ought to be focusing on improving. This model I have found helpful, and I think my clients have found it helpful. And again, it's just one way of dividing things up, but certainly not the only way. But again, at the heart of the culture are belief systems. There are humans, the capital, then the organizational system structure, cultural drivers in the organization. Then there's the external landscape, the customers and competitors and technology, et cetera, right? And let's dive into that just a little bit. If you dive into the human capital, the people side, and in the next sections of the course, there is an assessment on 5 forms of capital. And those forms of capital are spiritual capital, social capital, human capital, innovation capital, and then financial capital. And I'm not going to go into the detail on that because I am later. But that's one aspect of looking at the culture of the organization. And then there's the system structure, technical systems and social systems that we've talked about. And there is literally the structure of the organization. And the structure of the organization has a high impact on culture, how we organize people. We have a work process that flows through the organization. Does a team of people manage that entire and feel responsible for that entire workflow? Well, it depends upon what it is. If the workflow is making a chair, making a piece of furniture, perhaps so. But what if it's making a Boeing 777 aircraft? Is one team going to manage the whole flow? I really don't think so. In fact, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of teams that manage that entire workflow. When you think about, the aluminum producer that makes the base of the airplane wing, the electronics, the avionics, the wiring in the aircraft. I mean, those are all separate functions, skills, and in fact, separate companies that manufacture those things. Boeing assembles them. So you have many, many teams. But how you structure teams and how you define their responsibilities is very essential to the culture of the organization. And we're going to get into that more. But I must tell you that I also have another course on team leadership. And it's all about that process of creating high-performing teams and leading high-performing teams. I'm not going to go into all that in this course because it would be redundant. But the nature of teams, team structure, team leadership is absolutely essential to the nature of the culture of the organization. And the degree to which our structure creates walls, silos, right, where people don't communicate across the silos, or the degree to which people communicate freely around a process, but through silo walls. The walls are porous rather than rigid, right? That speeds the flow and increases the ability to improve the flow of the work. So all that's about the nature of structure, and we will talk about that more later, but it's really critical to the culture of the organization. So all of these things make up the culture. None of them are the one thing, but as we go through the rest of the course, we're going to address all of these things. And this is what, when we get into the transformation section of the course, this is what must be designed. You must design the processes, the technical system, you must design the workflow, you must design the social system, the structure. All that is what will change the performance of the organization and cause the strategy to be executed rather than, as these things often do, inhibit the execution of strategy. I hope that makes sense. Thanks.